Last time, I talked about how I released the game and what happened, how many people played the game, and then about how it got stolen. And then I went off to work on a mobile game, but then my favorite artist with oil in their name, ArtManOil, popped into Discord and asked me if they could redo my entire game's art. My art is passable. It does the trick, it's good enough. But I've worked with ArtManOil on other projects, namely Casino Roll, which turned out really good considering it was made in 48 hours. So I couldn't really say no. When someone that talented offers to help, you just accept it. So we got to talking about the specifics of how much was going to get changed, and I was telling them that we should do it in chunks in case they run out of steam or the project gets too big, and that way whatever they get done won't look totally out of place with everything else in the game if it's just the UI looks a certain way, or just the bosses look a certain way, or just the characters look a certain way. As long as it's not a case of some of the enemies got updated and some of them didn't. But they were adamant about doing the entire project. So we got to work. The initial plan was for me to finish up my mobile game and then join them on the project to add in their art. But they were doing it so fast and so quickly, and it was looking so good that I had to join in. So the mobile game got put on hold, and I dove into this game. The first thing we talked about was starting with the environments. Because like I said before, if they did the environments and the world, and all of the enemies got left the same, it wouldn't look as bad as if they did half the enemies. And this is where working the job I did kind of helped a little bit, because I have written up design documents for games and projects before, and that's what we needed here. We needed to create a design document with the expectations, styles, and so on that we would use in the project. Now, of course, I sent them the original game files so they could actually compare the animations to what they were making. But on top of that, I sent them a write-up talking about my expectations for what the game should look like, my philosophy on boss fights, and multiple games and art styles that I've taken inspiration from in creating this game. Things like the blocky text in Forager, for example, or a bunch of tiny things from Ravita. And of course, the Binding of Isaac. So with that sent over to them, we got to work. Starting out with designs actually made on paper, they would create the character in a bigger kind of form, and then we would talk about it and how easy it would be to change that into a Pixelart form, and what that would mean for boss fights and other variations of the same enemies, before anything got done with Pixelart. And with general sketches done of what could be, they got to work on the room, starting out with something unsaturated just to get the shapes right, but eventually sending me different versions with different colors to kind of see where we wanted things to be. We already agreed in the design document to use Indesca 64 for the color palette. So from there, it was just a matter of trying to figure out where to use the colors in the game. But once we figured that out, they had the room made within a single night, with portals instead of doorways, because a lot of people playing the game were confused about why when you walk through a door, it's a totally different room, because I didn't make this a Binding of Isaac style dungeon where you have like a permanent room or level. Instead, every room that you walk into is a totally new randomly generated room, and the room that you walked out of gets deleted. And so we wanted an explanation for that, so we added portals on the doorways. So I started adding it in and realized that that meant I needed to change something with the layers so that the player would go under the portals. The top of the portal was a piece of the wall, so they couldn't just go over it because that looked really silly, so I needed to find a way to make them go under it. And I could have just done this with layers. I could have cut up a couple layers and put the wall pieces on top, so when the character walks under them, they go under it rather than go over it. But each room is already consisting of like 7 or 8 different layers at this point, so I didn't want to add another one on top of that. So instead I used events to change the Z order of the portal layer based on where the player was in the room. And so this way, when they walk down to the bottom doors or the side doors, it would be above them. But when they walk to the portal on the top, it would be behind them until a certain point, where they would then go behind it. And then this presented another little quirk of the game, in that stretch between where the portal stopped and you walked behind it, and the next room started, was a fair distance, so you could walk behind the door and then just be hidden. And it felt really awkward and weird to have to hold the up button to continue going before you finally went to the other room. And so to fix that, I threw in a hack where when you walk through the portal and you get to that certain distance, instead of having to walk that distance, it just teleports you to the next room, or at least teleports you to the first pixel of the next room. And that way the transition gets triggered the moment you walk past the portal. This meant though that I had to go in and change all of the collision masks and points because, of course, with anything that you add to the game or change in the game, you end up with bugs or issues because that's just how things go.
Can I stay with you?
What?
Can I stay with you, please?
Of course!
Really?
No.
And so I went in and had to change all the collision masks, and one of the things that was commented about in the old version was that these little divots where the doorway is were death traps. While dashing, you can get caught in those, and then you're just a sitting duck waiting to get shot. So I flattened those out, so now the wall is actually flat, with a little bit of an invisible wall there, but I don't think it's so bad that people are going to get upset. At least it's much better than falling into these pits while you're trying to dodge away from an attack. And so now with the doorways in place and everything working just fine, I think that looks really good. And while I was happy with what I had before, you have to accept when something is better than what you could do for the greater good of the project. So this is a huge step up. And the one last thing I had to do with the doors was tweak the transition points. So when you walk through a doorway in the old version, there's a point on the floor in the next room that you would transition to. And so I needed to go into the floor object and change all of those points a little bit so they match up better with where you're supposed to go now. So you don't do the transition and end up halfway inside of a wall, because that would be bad. Now for the enemies, we had a big discussion about styles and how things are supposed to work and how to create a uniform kind of look to the whole game. But the idea of having every enemy look and act the same as if they were all skeletons or all undead or all something else, that's just kind of boring. So instead we decided to go the opposite route, where every enemy is unique and interesting in its own way. So there's still going to be the spider spawner and then the spider boss. That's how I believe things should work in a game, because then you see common themes and all that kind of gamey stuff. But the enemies won't be so classic. So instead of demon, spider, and ghost, it's going to be boxer, stone crab, and a mini sun. So everything's a little more random now, but gamey and cartoony in a way that's silly and kind of hopefully fun. We have plans for a lot of things down the road for colors and particle effects and things like that, but hopefully it all comes together in a weird mesh of fun, as if that makes any sense. But working with ArtManOil has been kind of like trying to stop a runaway train. They just have so much passion and energy that I kind of feel like I'm just there to be the counterweight, the thing that kind of pulls the project back in. The bigger the game gets, it's then my responsibility to bring it to life in the game. So I think I've said the words, "Be careful about scope creep," like a dozen times already. So between their passion and my restraint, I think that's going to be the perfect balance for creating the game. They've convinced me to expand the game in ways that I was afraid to, because I would then need to make it all, do all of the art and the sound effects and everything. But now with them there, I can expand the game in certain ways that I couldn't before. The biggest planned change is going to be the boss fights, actually, but we'll save that for another time. The next thing I jumped into was adding in all of the enemies that they were making for the game. They're using a weird program called Pixelart.com or web or something, instead of Aspray like I'm using. So when they sent me the files, the images were in a square rather than shaped to the actual image that was going to go into the game. And so the first thing I needed to do was cut these images up in Asprite and make sure that they align with each animation before I could then bring them over into my game engine. And the first enemy that I brought over was the stone crab, which was added to replace the spider. So now, instead of a giant spider for the boss at the end, it's going to be a giant crab.
Make it look shiny.
And because ArtManOil had my original files and I gave them the design document and they kind of knew how this character was supposed to play out, it was really just a matter of me taking the images and slotting them in. I did need to change the points and collision mask for the object, but that was pretty much it. And I really like the way that it came out. But before I show the other enemies in the game, I'd like to ask you a favor. Now the next video is going to be more art and less game design, so I can't really ask you about anything game design related. But go into the comments and say hi to ArtManOil. And if you like their art, throw that in the comment too. Just show them some love. Okay, so for the rest of the enemies, it was basically the same thing. There were some times where I would need to tweak things or change the animations around a little bit because they just didn't fit with the mechanics in-game, and sometimes I had to change the mechanics in-game themselves to make them fit the animation. So the popper enemy, for example, before they would walk away at a slower pace, and when they jumped away, they would do like jumping jacks to get ready to jump, and then they would jump away. So rather than sticking with that, it's been changed to this. Which meant that I needed to change how the animations worked, when you could actually shoot them, so you can't shoot them when they're jumping away, and the sound effects. But I think the result is way better. And from there was pretty much smooth sailing for most of the enemies. But now I'm going to leave you with possibly my favorite animation of the bunch, the new version of the beehive. A huge thank you to my patrons. Because of them, my coffee cup is full. And as always, the links to all the places that I hang out are down below, and if you decide to click on one, then I'll see you there.